I'm very, very, very pleased that we have Professor Ellie Dommett today from King's College London, who will be doing our last webinar of this academic year. So thank you very much, Ellie. Professor Dommett is Professor of Neuroscience at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London. She also won a National Teaching Fellowship Award in 2024, and she has done a lot of work about optimizing the use of digital tools to create an inclusive higher education experience. And part of her work has also been with the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning to examine the link between digital skills and the well-being of both staff and students. So we're very pleased that today she'll be talking to us about digital education, virtual learning environments, student well-being, and neurodiversity. So thank you, Ellie, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. I should just try and quickly work out how to share. I'm working across multiple screens. This is always the thing when you say, oh yeah, I'm an expert in digital education, and then you can't actually get your technology to do anything. So just bear with me while I get up the right one. There we go. I also have this joy of when I now come into the office, so I'm in the office at the moment, my setup in the office is less effective than my setup at home, so I can never find or do anything. Right, so I'm going to talk, just while I bring up my slides to share, I'm going to talk about really virtual learning environments, but I'm going to give a little bit of context to that because I think it's part of a broader kind of area and way in which education is going at the moment. So I'm now hopefully able to share. Let's see. Okay. So I think I'm hoping that has worked. Does that look like it should look as a presentation? Great.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk about virtual learning environments, but I'm going to talk specifically about two areas that we focused on, which is student wellbeing just in the general student population, and then with virtual learning environments in terms of neurodiversity. So looking at neurodivergent students, but also including neurotypical students to kind of support a neurodiverse classroom, if you like. So I guess the first thing is, I said about digital education, but I think really what I mean when I talk about digital education these days is online education. So when we look back historically at digital education, the history of digital education, of course, has come from distance learning. So, universities making use of teaching students at a distance hasn't always been online. In more recent years, of course, it has. The Open University is probably the most well-known example of that in the UK. And for those of us of a certain age and older can remember when the OU used to play educational programs at sort of 3-4 o'clock in the morning, and you would set your video recorder or you would wait up to watch them, and that was your course material. You were learning through these videos and textbooks that they were sending out. So that was the kind of the early version of digital, if you like, just using TV programs and later sending out CDs and DVDs to staff. But in the 1980s, we saw the first online course at the University of Toronto. And then by the time we come to the mid-1990s, virtual learning environments had emerged, or learning management systems. They weren't being used by all universities at that point. So I went to university in the late 90s. I didn't have a virtual learning environment at that time, but they were available. So they were starting to emerge. And as you would expect, the universities that made the biggest use of these were those that were offering distance education. But then over time, we've seen virtual learning environments be incorporated into conventional university degrees. So now when a student goes off to study at King's, Oxford, Sheffield, wherever they're going, they have a virtual learning environment that is at a minimum used as a repository for them for information, recordings of their lectures, handouts, copies of reading lists, that kind of thing. But increasingly since COVID, they're being used in more dynamic ways and more personalized ways. There'll be integrated quizzes, assessment tools integrated within it, opportunities sometimes for students to make notes and store their stuff all within a virtual learning environment. In the UK, of course, we have several virtual learning environments in use. The most common ones are Blackboard, Canvas, and Moodle. But if you came to, so we use Moodle at King's, but if you went to a King's student and said, how do you get on with Moodle? They would not know what you were talking about, of course, because we brand it. So all the universities effectively take a shell, whether that is Blackboard or Moodle or whatever, and they brand it to look like their own. And that branding is quite important for something I'm going to mention later on. So this desire to kind of brand and make it clear what your product is can actually be a little bit more unhelpful than we might realize. So when I'm talking about digital education, what I'm really talking about is online education, because now everything is available online, and that has various advantages and disadvantages. The advantages of online learning are almost exactly the same as they were for distance learning, or they have been pitched for distance learning over the years. But because of the nature of VLEs, for example, we have the opportunity to offer a more personalised learning approach. So you can look at what students are accessing, you can send them on a particular pathway. So a very basic example of this that we use, which, as I said, is very basic, is students will watch an online video and they'll have a very short quiz afterwards. Now, that quiz is not designed to be intellectually demanding or require high-level cognitive functioning particularly. It's really designed to be an attention check. And if they don't get 2 out of 5 of the questions right, they can't access the next video or the next learning resource. If they do get it right, they can go straight on to the next one. So what we're trying to do is, in that sense, we are just trying to modulate, if you like, how they can go through the materials according to how they're getting on. And there's, of course, many more advanced things you can do. You can look at a student's starting point, so actually start your course with some kind of assessment and then guide them through it, depending on the outcomes of that. So personalised learning is a big advantage, or thought to be a big advantage of online learning. It is also flexible and accessible. We hear about students being able to study anywhere. I remember I did my qualifications that allow me to have this job, if you like. I did at conventional universities, turning up, going to lectures, that kind of thing. But then just, I wouldn't say for fun, but I think it probably was mainly for fun. I did a distance learning degree with the Open University in Religious Studies, and I spent a lot of time sitting in car parks waiting for children to finish various dance classes, sports activities, with my textbooks and my notepad in the front of the car trying to make my notes, which of course, and these days that would be sitting there with my laptop. So it is very, very flexible and in theory very accessible. But of course, virtual learning environments and anything online is only accessible if someone has given thought to making it accessible. And there are lots of issues around how inclusive a lot of platforms and resources are. But in theory, online learning offers something flexible and accessible. There's also good evidence to suggest that students who learn online develop better skills in independent learning than those that learn in the classroom. And this kind of makes sense. You know, if they come into the lecture theatre or they come into the seminar and they're getting a bit bored or they're going off task, chances are the person who is leading that session or their peers will bring them back into focus and help them regulate their own learning. When they're working completely online, or even doing significant portions online, they have to be able to manage their own time. It does make for a steep learning curve, but potentially it fosters independence. It also supports digital skill development. And this one is a bit of a chicken or an egg thing, because obviously if you lack digital skills, learning online can be extremely difficult to the point where it's so daunting that you give up. But also, by learning online, you develop those key skills. So I think the idea of developing digital skills through learning is really helpful. And most employers these days would be expecting students, actually school leavers, but certainly graduates, to have a certain level of digital proficiency. Online learning, if it's fully online, can be more affordable. So if you look at the tuition fees, for example, to the Open University, they are more affordable than somewhere else. And because you're often able to do it flexibly around time, it gives you opportunities perhaps to work more for paid employment or whatever your other responsibilities are. It can be more engaging. And I'm saying can be here because I think that's a really important point. A lot of online learning can be very dry and dull, but when done properly, it can be very engaging. So as an example of this, when we shifted all our learning online during COVID at King's, one of the things I would normally have given a lecture on, well, I still gave a lecture, but it was a video recorded one, was depression. And as part of that lecture, I might have talked and discussed with the students examples of impact of depression. You know, what do you think would happen to this person if they were experiencing this, this, and this? And we weren't able to do that, weren't able to have that interactivity. But what I was able to do was actually speak to somebody who had experienced depression, get them to write their story, and then get that audio recorded by somebody else, so it wasn't their voice, to preserve their anonymity. And then that audio recording could be made available online just to complement the, I don't like to say my lectures are dry, but just to complement the drier lecture to give somebody a real world experience. So online learning does offer some potentially very engaging sides. But there are challenges to online learning, and I think these are all headlines in and around the end of the pandemic. You know, online learning has a bad reputation. It has a bad reputation because I think partly because of what happened during the pandemic, that students felt that they were lacking the university experience. And we actually saw headlines around, you know, why am I paying my fees for online learning? And it did beg the question. You found yourself thinking, well, you don't think your fees actually cover your social life at university, do they? They are about the learning. And in many cases, it is far more expensive to produce high quality online learning than it can be in person. But it got a bit of a bad rep. So there are student perceptions against online learning, and staff, I should say. There can just be general perceptions that are not very positive about it. There can also be challenges with student engagement, and sometimes these can hit the most at-risk students more, because the students that might struggle for whatever reason, again, you could pick them up in a class, you might be able to spot they're having difficulties and be able to offer extra support or guidance. You can't do that if they're behind a screen. There's also potentially issues around inclusivity and boundary setting. It's very difficult to switch off. I'm sure we've all done this. You think, I'm done for the day, and then you just happen to see an email on your phone and you find it very difficult to switch off. And the two there with the stars are the ones I'm going to say a little bit more about and some specific research that we've done. There's also, and I think this is really important, there's also a big digital divide still. We did a survey, just a survey of our program at King's during the pandemic. And what we wanted to understand was whether our students had a safe space to study. And by safe space, I don't kind of mean in the term that we often use it now. I just mean, did they have somewhere at home they could study uninterrupted? When they were back in the family home. So King's has a lot of commuter students anyway, so quite a lot of our students will live with their family anyway. But obviously, all of them nearly ended up doing so during COVID. So we asked the question about whether they had space and whether they had a dedicated device. And what we found was, yes, the vast majority did have somewhere. There were some that were sharing bedrooms with younger siblings who, of course, weren't at school because of COVID, and that was creating some difficulties for study time. But most did have a sensible study space, and most had a device they could use. But there were 5% of students that did not have their own device. So again, they were sharing that device with other members of the family. And of course, everybody was working from home or doing their schoolwork from home, so it was a little bit chaotic. We know that not all students will have access to devices. Mobiles are easier for them to come by than laptops or tablets, but even then they'll be using an older version of a phone, for example, so an older kind of operating system. They may be relying on mobile data instead of good kind of high quality broadband, and they may not have the skills to adequately use everything that they've got. Software is a major issue. So I know at King's, the students get a subscription to Office 365, so they have everything. Same at the Open University, because I still teach there as well, so I know what they're doing there. But of course, that's when they get to university, they haven't always had that in the lead up to it, which means that they might not really be as familiar with even basic things like Office and, how to format a Word document or a PowerPoint document. So to expect them to have the digital skills to navigate through the many tools that we use. And sometimes it's not very clear to a student where one tool finishes and another one ends. So we have all our lecture capture, which we use Echo 360 at King's. All our lecture capture is embedded within our VLE. But of course, the functionality varies slightly. And then to add confusion, our captured lectures use Echo 360. Our pre-recorded videos use Kaltura, and they have slightly different menus. So if a student is not as digitally skilled as one of their peers, they can be quite disadvantaged. So there are some challenges to online education as well. So I'm just going to talk about two pieces of research. One is around the well-being and kind of switching off, and the other one is around inclusivity. So to start with them, what did we do with VLEs and student well-being? So this is a very longer study than we expected it to be, as they often are. We actually applied for this funding in 2018 and were successful getting it in 2019, and it was for a PhD student. And this work was done in collaboration with Nicola Byram, who set up Student Minds, the national student mental health charity. That charity have since gone on to lead on the Mental Health Charter Award that universities can apply for. And this project was a PhD program with a partner in Student Minds. So the PhD student did research, as you would expect for her PhD, but she also did a placement within Student Minds. And the reason we were thinking about this was we thought, well, actually, okay, there's two things. I was thinking quite a lot about VLEs and how brilliant they are, but also how difficult it is to switch off when something is constantly available to you. And then also reflecting on the fact that if you struggled with technology, you could find a VLE really quite challenging, and it falls into that bracket that we often see in education where we accidentally disadvantage students by putting barriers up to them, showing us what they can do. So some forms of assessment, if your assessment guidance is so complicated that you require a PhD to understand what you're being required to do, students that are more than capable of doing it don't understand what they're meant to do, and they end up struggling. And I thought, well, VLEs could be the same. So we wanted to have a think about how VLE use can impact mental well-being, and we left it quite open. We talked about positive and negative impacts. The challenge with this was that we started doing it just before COVID hit. So you'll notice on the slide that some of our focus groups were done face-to-face and some of them were done online, and that's because all the campuses shut halfway through. And the PhD student actually, for various reasons, including COVID, switched to part-time study because you really don't want something that's going to massively change online education happening in the middle of your PhD on online education. It was a bit of a bit unfortunate on the timing. So she made a point to conduct her research across different types of universities. So we have research intensive. So this was kind of Russell Group style universities and the post-92s as well. And we wanted to make sure we heard from more than one VLE type. So we have both Moodle and Blackboard in there. We weren't able to include Canvas as well. So conducted a series of focus groups and interviews. If somebody specifically requested a one-to-one, they could have a one-to-one interview, but most of them were focus groups. And these were all undergraduate students, and we worked with undergrads specifically because they have quite a long journey with their VLE, so they get used to it in the kind of the first year, and by the third year, they're quite proficient. But also, we were aware that the amount of VLE use seems to vary more. Certainly at King's, it seems to vary a lot more in taught postgraduate programs. And of course, a PhD student may never use a VLE depending on the lab they're in and how that works. So we are focused on undergraduates. They are also the cohort where there seems to be the most concern about increasing mental health problems with a higher than expected from non-student age-matched individuals' level of mental health disorders being diagnosed, particularly anxiety and depression. So she conducted all these focus groups or interviews with students from these universities, and we found 3 themes were really emerging. And these 3 themes then went on to change, I guess, the direction of the research a little bit. So the first theme that emerged was around lecturer VLE use could either support or undermine what happened to the students' mental well-being. And examples of this, so a very well-organised VLE meant that students felt more confident and motivated, and they were able to concentrate better. Part of that was simply because they knew what they were meant to be doing. So if something was very clearly structured, the content appeared where they expected it to and in the order they expected it to, and the assessment brief was really under a section labeled assessment and not under something else, they felt far more confident in tackling whatever the learning was that they were trying to do. How the lecturers communicate via the VLE was also important in terms of connectedness and progression. And the examples they gave here were discussion forums and discussion boards. When the lecturers sort of used those to almost put up a barrier between them and students, that was unhelpful to the students and it made them feel bad. When they invited questions, responded positively. I think we've all done this. We've all sort of seen a question that we think, that's a very silly question. I had a question asked to me recently. We've gone back to in-person exams, but they're open book. They are computer-based, and a student asked me if it was okay to take a pen into the exam. And I thought, well, yes, that feels a little bit obvious. But instead of saying, yes, you can take a pen into the exam, which would have been a fair and honest answer, I said, oh, that's not a stupid question at all. Yes, you will be doing your exam answers on a computer, but of course you can take a pen in case you want to make any notes, because you are allowed to take your notes because this is an open book exam. So making sure that the communication was open and approachable made a real difference to how students felt. And then this was an interesting one. Lecturer VLE skills impact on student VLE skills. And what they meant by this was when a lecturer is pretty inept at using the VLE, it doesn't really help students know how to use the VLE either. And when a lecturer is better at it, structures it well, sets things up easily, students develop their skills more easily. There's a caveat here, is that students don't know what's under the control of the lecturer and what's under the control of the institution. So for example, at King's, if you're a module leader, you cannot change the short name of your module on Moodle. And the short name is drawn from our student record system, and it's just a series of pointless numbers that nobody understands, and you can't change it. But students wouldn't know that we can't change that, and that only the people with the higher level permissions in IT could change that, and they don't want to change it because that code links all the enrollments through. So we recognise that when students say lecturer VLE use impacts on their skills, it's actually broader. It's how the VLE is used by the institution. So that was the third theme that we found. The second theme related to productivity, academic performance, and mental well-being. So students really appreciated the fact that the VLE was there. They felt it was inclusive. They felt the fact that it was there and it was available meant it felt like a safety net. And that was good. That was good for students that were stressed, but it was also good for students that were okay, because they knew if they missed a class, they didn't need to stress about it because they could just watch the recording on the VLE, or they could download the slides or something. So they felt that the fact that they could access it at any time, and that was a safety net, was a good thing. They also felt that the fact that they could access it from anywhere was a good thing, because if they had to go home for the weekend, if they we've had cases where student accommodation, their term time accommodation has been flooded or damaged, and they've had to just kind of pick up with what they've got and go and stay somewhere else. They could always access it. So the anytime, anywhere was appreciated. But as we had originally hypothesized, it was also seen as a double-edged sword because they didn't feel they could switch off. In a later study, when we asked them about logging off of the VLE, it seems like they never log off. It's always a tab open in their browser in the background. And when they see a lot of forum posts coming through from their friends or their peers, because they've got the email subscription set up, If a post comes through at 3 a.m., there's a feeling, a sense within them that actually I should be working. That student's working, I'm not working. Should I be working right now? And even if they think about it and they go, no, it's 3 a.m., I shouldn't be working now, they've entertained that thought, and that makes the boundary setting harder. They also felt that because the VLE was so fundamental to their productivity and their performance and how they learn, that when there were technical difficulties with it, if the VLE went down at any point, that caused very strong emotions, very strong negative emotions, and a lot of frustration. And then the final theme was an interesting one, which I think has implications for how we run our student inductions for things like VLEs, because the VLEs at universities are more complex and varied than most schools would use, even though they might have something akin to our VLEs. So they realized that learning the VLE was really hard. Learning to navigate it was a difficult thing that required effort. Once they'd done it, they realized that effort was worthwhile, but only once they'd done it. So there is a need to potentially try and motivate and support students in making that initial effort. And I think being transparent that actually this is effortful, but it will be helpful in the end. And their mindset to how they approach the VLE directly impacted on their emotional response and productivity. So if they kind of thought, oh, this is going to be a bit of a slog, but I'm going to find all the information I needed, they had less of an emotional response than if they had a different mindset to it and they then encountered difficulties they weren't expecting. So what the student did who was working on this was she then thought about the theoretical models that might be used to understand the VLE and managed to relate this to self-determination theory. So self-determination theory, for anyone that doesn't know, is a theory related to the basic psychological needs, and it says that if three things are met, then that will be a good thing for people, that we need these things to be met. Autonomy, competency, and relatedness. Now, autonomy in this sense doesn't necessarily mean control. It means meaningful choice and inviting language. So, if there are two essay questions available to you, for example, on a course, you have a meaningful choice between them. If the deadline is only a week after the content for one of those is set, and you know the essay will take you 2 weeks to write, that isn't really a meaningful choice. So giving students meaningful choice in their use of the VLE is helpful. Making sure that the VLE is structured in a way that does allow students to work through. If they have unclear expectations and an unclear structure, it makes it very difficult for them to be competent in their use of it. But also, of course, encouraging competence by teaching how to use the VLE is really important. I think we just assume students know, but much of the time they don't. And then that relatedness, so encouraging interactions, not just with staff, but also with students through the VLE, other students through the VLE. So she's gone on since then to develop a VLE use instrument, and she's also done some work with staff. But the reason we moved away, so the original plan of this research was to develop an intervention, so to adjust the design of the VLE and see if we could see an impact on wellbeing. But when it became apparent that it was really difficult to be clear what was under lecturer control and what was under institutional control, and the sheer level of variation, we moved away from that, and we decided to just further investigate self-determination theory in the context of the VLE and develop a scale for doing that. But I'm now going to talk about the second area of research that we've done work on, and that is around the inclusion idea and specifically neurodiversity. So neurodiversity is a term we hear a lot about now, but I will give a bit of a definition, so apologies if this is all very familiar to you already. It's a term that was coined in the 1960s. At the time, it was really talking about autism, but now it actually refers to a range of conditions. And you can think of it as being a kind of, so like we think about biodiversity to represent all the possible living things, neurodiversity is about representing all the possible neurotypes. And at one end, we have what we would consider neurotypical, and at the other end, we have neurodivergent. And it's thought that neurodivergent individuals might make up around 1 in 5, so around 20% of the population. But actually our ability to know this and know the actual numbers is quite challenged. We just recently had it was an internal grant, and we had it turned down, and they said, you need to tell us the proportion of neurodivergent students at King's. And I said, well, we would love to, but King's doesn't know. We've asked, and you don't have those records, so we don't know. But we think probably a best guess is 1 in 5 of the general population, and that is including those coming to university. So although the term neurodivergent is around neurodiversity and kind of incorporating every neurotype, this little graph on the left here shows what this might mean in terms of functioning. So each green blob is a kind of different type of functioning. So you can see a calculator, for example, so that's mathematical processing and functioning. You can see a book, so that's going to be comprehension. There's visual processing for the eye. There's lots of different functions. And what we see in a neurotypical person is that generally those functions are all pretty similar to each other. So you can be reasonably good at maths, reasonably good at writing, reasonably good at comprehension tasks or creativity or that kind of thing. They're all pretty similar. And so you get this relatively flat line, which is the kind of turquoisey line. If you're neurodivergent, what you typically find is that the profile is more spiky. So sometimes you hear people referring to themselves as neurospiky. And what that really means is that they could be excellent at one particular area and really quite rubbish at another. And there isn't always a relationship between them. So they have a spiky profile instead of a flat profile. So that's another way that we can conceptualize neurodiversity. Although the neurodiversity movement speaks against having like a diagnosis and a deficit, of course, we still do use diagnostic terms, and all the terms on the rainbow colored image on the other side are different forms of neurodiversity. And we have approached much of our research in this area looking at autism or autism spectrum conditions, autism spectrum disorders, depending on the terminology, like ADHD and dyslexia. And the reason we've gone for those three in particular is they seem to be the three which are most common in university populations, and we're interested in learning in higher education. So that's the reason we've gone for those three. They're also very, very often co-occurring. So if you have ADHD, you're sort of 50% more likely than the general population to also have autism or to also have dyslexia. So they often occur together. So the area that we were particularly interested in was cognitive load in online learning. So cognitive load refers to, it's really about mental effort. How much of your working memory resource is being used to process something? And we were interested in this because we thought actually working memory is very heavily used in online learning. And yet we know that neurodivergent individuals, whether it's because they have ADHD or autism or another one of the conditions, they can struggle with working memory in a way that others wouldn't. And so we were interested in, particularly in cognitive load in working memory, cognitive load in online learning for these individuals. Cognitive load can be conceptualized in different ways. The ways are shown on the image, but it's worth saying that, again, we seem to always choose projects where something fundamental changes halfway through that is beyond our control, just for an extra challenge. So halfway through this PhD, the way that cognitive load had been conceptualized for decades was finally challenged and changed. So that was a little surprise for us. But in effect, what it was arguing was intrinsic load is the complexity of the information. It's the hardness of the task. Extraneous load is the amount of mental effort that gets put everywhere else. So any distractions that are there to you. And germane load is about integrating the information that you're trying to learn with existing information already kind of in your brain. And so the argument now is that actually germane load and intrinsic load are one and the same thing. So really it's only two-part, not tripart. But however we conceptualize it, cognitive load seems really important in online learning. So we started this project taking quite a different approach to some of our other work. And that approach was one that was of participatory research. And I don't want to dwell too much on this figure. It's that, I just want to get across really that what you'll see is going around the edge, the dotted line shows a research advisory board. And what we did for this was we actually worked with neurodivergent students to design all the research, test all the protocols, even write it up, and some of them co-authored the publications. And I think that really adds validity to the work. Some of the things we thought were obvious, they didn't necessarily think were the most critical things, and other things we hadn't thought of at all, particularly for the laboratory experiments, could make a really big difference. So I would definitely advocate getting involved with your participatory research, so finding your participants and asking them to help you design it, and make sure you pay them, because they are experts by experience, so they should always be paid for their input. But before we actually even got to the point where we were ready to do any experiments, you'll see on the screen we did a systematic review. And I think this next image, which is very complicated, but again, I just want to draw your attention to the 3 boxes where there is a dotted line around them. They were the only 3 constructs where people had even considered neurodiversity. So all of the other studies in this review, there were almost 100 studies in the review, they hadn't mentioned neurodiversity at all. They just said undergraduate students online learning, as though undergraduate students was like a homogenous thing, that they were all exactly the same. And in those 3 studies, they didn't just focus on neurodivergent learners, but they at least acknowledged they were there. So this really was a gap in the literature. And so the first thing we thought we would do with our participatory advisory group was develop a focus group schedule and run some focus groups. And we looked at where cognitive load comes from in neurodivergent students and neurotypical students. So we looked at sources, domains, and moderators. Now, what you'll see on the screen here is reassuringly, for those of us that are very passionate about inclusive education, most of the things are in the middle of the Venn diagram. Most of the things that matter and impact neurodivergent students are also impacting neurotypical students. So when you get those very resistant people that say, why would I change everything for 3 people in my class when I've got another 40 that it might upset? It's really not going to upset those other 40. They're quite likely to benefit as well. But just again to draw your attention to the very specific things that neurodivergent students struggle with, which weren't mentioned by neurotypical, on the right of the diagram, they really struggle when there is a lack of clear curriculum, when captions and transcripts are inaccurate. So we're being told that captions and transcripts are great, and they are accessible, and they can make it more inclusive. But if they have inaccuracies, that's actually almost worse than them not being there, was the view of the students. They struggle with prolonged periods of listening and prolonged periods of writing and making decisions. So there you see a little bit of a conflict, because remember in the previous study I mentioned about having meaningful choice. But I think that's it. Meaningful choice can be good, but having to make lots and lots of little decisions to get from A to B is not particularly helpful. So really, really clear guidance and clear instructions is important. And I've just come from another meeting before this, one of my lab meetings. We're doing a study on generative AI, which I'm going to mention at the end as a kind of what we're doing next. But one of the interesting things that came out of that was that we got some students to do a simulated learning activity, and then we asked them to talk us through how they used AI. And one of the neurodivergent students with autism effectively said, I use AI to put the question into more autistic language, so that they're using it to explain the question to them, not answer the question, tell them what the question means. And we've also had that from dyslexic students as well. So this lack of clarity for these students can be a really, really big deal. After we did the focus groups are obviously great for helping you understand the rich experiences of the students, but they're not necessarily generalizable. So we then did a large scale study where we did an online survey. We measured symptoms of ADHD, dyslexia and autism, and we looked at cognitive load. And the kind of short story is that intrinsic and germane cognitive load didn't differ between neurotypical and neurodivergent students, but extraneous cognitive load did. So particularly, perhaps unsurprisingly, those with ADHD struggled with lots of other things distracting them and taking up their working memory effort. So then the nice bit of this, the bit where the kind of neuroscience comes in, is we were then able to create a VLE. Now, right at the start, I mentioned branding and how we all love branding because it's, you know, it's what makes kings kings or Queen Mary's or whatever. But actually, this is a very simple VLE you see on the screen here. This is what we mocked up. And it is unbranded, but it looks like ours, but it's unbranded. But you'll see there's side menus there. So the first side menu is like with all these multicolored things, and they could click for different bits. Then you've got a module outline, then you've got an upcoming event. So that's what most VLEs look like. And of course, it's that kind of functionality that makes Amazon work. You know, you go on to buy a set of AA batteries and you come off having bought a small unicorn, and you didn't really go on there for that. But that's how they work. They pop up with all these things that you might be interested in. And VLEs to a degree have done the same thing. So what we did was we get students to answer a quick test about something. It's actually about storms. And then we ask them to watch a short video. It's about 10 minutes long on thunderstorms. And then they answer another test to see if their knowledge has changed. And we check, the first one really is just to check they're not some kind of crazy storm expert in our sample. But while they're watching the video, we are tracking their eye movements, and we're using EEG in order to understand what they're doing. And what we found, which was nice, was that neurodivergent and neurotypical students performed exactly the same on the assessment of their learning. There is nothing in the literature to suggest that neurodivergent students are less academically able, and that was backed up by what we found as well. Unfortunately, we did find that neurodivergent students had reduced intrinsic cognitive load and higher extrinsic cognitive load when we looked at eye movements, and the higher extraneous cognitive load was backed up by EEG. So what it looks like is these students are working harder. They are having to put more mental effort in to achieve the same outcome than others. And when we looked at where they were looking, sure enough, they were looking all in these side menus instead of in the center at the thing. So they were being distracted by the other content. We now incidentally have got the draw functionality in Moodle, so students can just close those side panels, they disappear, they just completely go, which I think is a good thing. So based on this research, the PhD student and the Research Advisory Board came up with a framework for online learning that would make it inclusive for a neurodiverse classroom. So whether you are neurotypical or not, but it should include everybody. And it talked about making sure content was delivered in multiple formats, keeping the environment simple and removing unnecessary things, those banners, the notifications, the images and the pop-ups that aren't needed. And that's something we definitely need to work on for our VLEs. Presenting information at appropriate pace and in certain size chunks. Of course, the beauty of a VLE is a student can self-pace. If it's a video, they can pause it, they can speed it up, they can slow it down, that kind of thing. But they do have to know how to do that. So you shouldn't just put a video there and assume they can self-pace. You would be providing guidance on how to do that. Make sure that everything is super clear. Have opportunities for check-ins. Now, that could be, obviously, in the case of somewhere like King's, our learning is in person, so we can have in-person check-ins and we get a sense from that how they were doing with their online stuff as well. But it could be using things like completion tracking and seeing what pages students have got to on the VLE. And then importantly, researching your practice. So that's where we got to with this project. And then, as I said, what we're currently doing is we're looking at how generative AI can be used to support learning, and how neurodivergent and neurotypical students use it on a learning task and understand the specific challenges and barriers they perceive to using AI. And the idea of this is to come up with a set of recommendations for how students, if you're asking students to use AI, what kind of recommendations might be helpful if some of those students are neurodivergent. So that's the various references to the specific studies I've talked about in case anyone is interested. And it's nice that I'm here talking about it, but of course I didn't do all of this work by myself. The key stars in this particular show are Anne Lawlerkampf and Katie Rako, who were the 2 PhD students, and then Vincent, Nicola and Juliet were their other supervisors as well. So I think if I stop sharing, because I can't see anything, so I will stop sharing. Yes, there we go. That's all.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you for your presentation. Really, really interesting. Now we've got 15 minutes left, so this is time for questions, comments. Feel free to raise your hand, unmute your mic, or type away. Yes, okay.
Thank you so much for really excellent presentation. I really like your framework for online learning, and I'm hoping that we will be allowed to adopt it and include it in VLE minimum standards. Well, my question is around the neurodiverse students that you studied. You said you did ADHD, dyslexia, and autism. But I was struck by one of the other characteristics of neurodiversity, which is intellectual disability. How can you adjust for students who may have an intellectual disability? I know you didn't include them in your research group, but I just thought there might be some students who have intellectual disability. That could be the disability that's within their neurodiverse sort of spectrum. And we don't know how many students have that. So how do you adjust for that? Because you said when you did your test, neurodiverse students performed equally well in the assessment test compared to neurotypical. And I just wondered, okay, you were looking at ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. What about intellectual disability? Do you think they would do as well? It's just a question.
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting one. I have to say that I think when you're just focusing on higher education, the students with severe intellectual disability sadly are unlikely to be getting through to us at conventional universities, obviously where a university doesn't have the same entry requirements, or elsewhere it might be easier. But yeah, I would expect that students with significant intellectual disability would probably do worse on the assessment. But that said, this was really, it was an MCQ test just to judge their knowledge. And it may be that they'd actually do absolutely fine on that, and it would be higher level cognitive skills that they'd find tricky. So that could be it. I think in terms of, I guess the other point is that most of the research, obviously all of the research we've done, because we're interested in neurodiversity in higher education, we've almost by definition got the successful ones, got the ones that have managed. In many cases, they talk about masking, girls in particular, not just autistic girls where we do hear more about masking, but we hear about stuff like, I can mimic how my neurotypical friends learn. So I think our cohort that we've looked at, because we're looking at university students, not just King's students, but we're looking at people that have got into higher education, are probably the high performing ones. And if we looked at a different group, we might find different results. But yeah, I suspect the intellectual disability, they might still do okay in the kind of test that we did because it was a basic MCQ. But if we wanted something more advanced, maybe they would find that more of a struggle. Yeah. But I don't think that would necessarily affect. So although they might be worse off to begin with and not quite reach neurotypical levels at the end, I don't think it would necessarily affect the EEG and the eye tracking, in that I think they probably still have higher extraneous cognitive load, I think. But that's something we haven't looked at.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm just going to go in order. A couple of questions in the chat. The first question comes from Leslie. Can you explain why group work was on the left-hand side of the Venn diagram?
Yes, so that was where neurotypical students found group work to be particularly challenging and a source of cognitive load. Now, I think there's all sorts of reasons for that, and I'm not sure if it's, so I guess the other thing to say is it could be that it's challenging for neurodivergent students as well, but they avoid it. by which I mean sometimes it's quite possible to choose modules where you don't have to work in small groups. And if you're somebody who is autistic and does not like to work with people you don't know, you might actually avoid it. But it was there because the neurotypical people found it to be a greater source of cognitive load than neurodivergent. But that could be an artifact of the kind of modules they're choosing. I guess that's a possibility. I also wonder sometimes if neurotypical students, and I'm being really judgy here, so I'm not, I think this is just purely my speculation. We hear a lot from neurodivergent students about the judgments made about them by their neurotypical peers. So I wonder if the neurotypical students are perhaps just judging those they work with in a way that makes them find the group work a little bit challenging. I don't know. It's possible.
Thank you. Another question from Sebastian. Did you or your PhD students find anything about how having neurodivergent lecturers influences the student experience of neurodivergent students?
So we didn't in that study, and in fact we've just finished writing up a priority setting study which was looking at research priorities for neurodiversity in higher education, and one of the priorities that came out at all the stages was whether a kind of disclosure from staff that they were neurodivergent impacted the student experience. And actually there's no research showing that, so we didn't do the research on it, we merely identified the research gap. But what we did by identifying the gap was search the literature to see if it had been answered, and it hasn't. There is a bit of a mix there. So I think on the one hand, a student realizing that one of their lecturers is neurodivergent too can create a sense of inclusion and belonging that isn't there otherwise. But the downside of that is, you know, we have neurodivergent staff members here, and students are very unforgiving if that means their email is missed or their coursework is returned a day late. So I think it's a bit of a, again, it could be a bit of a double-edged sword, but there isn't any research actually measuring the impact on students of knowing or having neurodivergent staff members.
Thank you. Another question from Jim. What key messages would you tell lecturers mention to students when introducing the VLE?
I think the first one would be to say straight away that this is hard, this is effortful, it's not going to come overnight, and that it comes with practice. So I think the effortful one, I think it would also be important leading off of that to make it clear where they can get help if they're still 6 weeks in and they can't find the lecture recordings. You know, don't make it a one-off offer of help. And then I think the other thing is that, and this only works if it's done properly, but if your module pages are as consistent as possible, really it's about the lecturer explaining to students that this is the general pattern. So if they want to find their timetable, it will be under that section. If they want to find this, it will be under that section. And then constantly reiterating it as well. So when you're teaching and you sort of say, oh, well, the reader, you know, for the first 3 weeks at the end of the lecture, instead of going, you can find the information for next week here, actually log in and show them on the lectern. You know, so I think it's repeating, it's effortful, but it's structured and it's worthwhile when you get there. And actually, to be honest, students don't listen to lecturers half as much as they listen to each other. So one of the things that we've done, not here at King's, but we've done it at the OU, is as a cohort of students are finishing, is we've kind of gone, can you answer this question for us? What do you wish you'd known about the VLE before you started? And they answer it. They say exactly the same things as we would have said, but students listen to them. So I actually think having a kind of student input into that guidance you give to your next lot of students is really helpful.
Thank you. A question from Susie. Do your online platforms work with Dragon software?
So I'm pretty confident the Open University one does, and that's built on Moodle because the OU is so good at all its accessibility stuff. I think, so we're Moodle as well at King's, and I think ours does, but I have not used it. But I know students are offered assistive technology, and part of that is to help them with the VLE. I assume it's Dragon, but I don't know. And I can't answer for Blackboard or Canva.
Thanks. Lots of questions you have. Thank you, everyone. Next one is from Salah. When planning for digital accessibility, we take into account the needs of learners who use screen readers. Are there any needs of neurodivergent learners that might conflict with these?
I don't think so. I think the key thing is, yeah, I mean, I think if your slides and your documents are accessible enough for a screen reader, they should be accessible enough for someone who is neurodivergent, keeping in mind that prolonged periods of listening or prolonged periods of reading is quite difficult. So lots and lots of chunks of text, big chunks of text, can be really off-putting if you have dyslexia or ADHD. And actually, one of the Gen AI participants said, well, what I do is I take the big chunk of text in my module guide or my assessment brief and I put it in Gen AI and I say, please give me this as bullet points, because then I can manage it okay. So I don't think there would be an issue unless you're working with lots of text. There is some suggestion of color perception differences for ADHD. I think it's in the blue yellow. But so I know we always avoid, you're told don't use red and green on a graph because red-green colorblind is quite common. I'm actually blue-green colorblind, so I have no idea what's going on. So when I was trying to describe that graph earlier, you were probably thinking, what color is she talking about? But I think being aware of colors and being aware of spacing is important, but none of that is problematic for screen readers. So it would be the same document would be fine. Not having your text really squished together. So the line spacing quite generous is a good thing.
Thanks. And last question from the chat. My question is, we've done a lot of work specifically around template design in our Moodle instance. Some of these focused on the course format we used. Did you have any research surrounding this? We've conducted test scenarios and used screen readers, but it'd be interesting to see any findings you have.
So we haven't looked at course format. So the version that we showed in our simulated learning was literally a single kind of page with a video embedded. We do know that the collapsible, so we have various course formats because King's, so we have a grid format, we have collapsed topics, and there's various other ones. We typically only use two, though. We typically only use collapsed topics or grid format. And I think the key thing is not, if there is an element of the number of clicks to get somewhere, but that's actually just general accessibility, but it's being able to get rid of that extraneous information. So not having a big banner, and we've moved away from that, and not having side drawers that can't be folded away so your contents list can disappear. But we haven't looked specifically at course format. I suspect, just thinking back to the other study, the VLE and Wellbeing study, that actually the format may be less important than the organization. So if you just have a very good set of consistent documents in grid format, that may be okay and no different if you had a very good set of consistent documents in collapsed topic. That's what I would imagine, but we haven't looked at specific templates.
Thanks. And now we do have a final question, just conscious of time, but I think it's a good one to end with. It's from Matthew. Do you have any suggestions for how those who work in digital education teams can influence lecturers to really understand and engage with all of the themes that you've identified?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So I know it was mentioned at the beginning that I'm also based in Seattle. So I kind of, for like about 15 years, I felt like I didn't really fit anywhere because I was sort of half in a learning technology bit and half as an academic researcher. And then I realized that actually this was like being bilingual. So I think sometimes as an academic, I think I can say that sometimes academics are a little bit dismissive of people working in IT or learning design or professional services staff. And I suspect the other way around can happen as well. And I think it's about learning to speak their language. And there's two things that really come across with academic staff is if you can present them with evidence, that is really helpful. So actually being able to share research papers, share slides, that kind of thing is really helpful. The other thing is about time saving. You know, we spend academics, so the research that we did with academics was really emphasizing just how much time is spent on the VLE and how hard it is. You know, nobody actually teaches you how to use the VLE. There's like one course, and unless you start your contract in September, you've missed it. So you're just running blind for the first year. And I think it's about showing them that if something is done really well and clearly and structured, they will get less queries from students on I can't find X and more queries actually on the academic side, which is what they came most of the time is what people come to do. They come to teach, they don't come to control the tech. So I think being able to show them the evidence, show them it's time saving and hold their hands. So we have a Tell Buddy scheme in my program, which we set up during COVID. So I got a group of academics who were more Tell savvy and they became Tell Buddies for all the other academics. So we set up their Keats pages, and then if they wanted to do anything a bit more adventurous or if they got stuck doing something, they had a named person. And that scheme works really well. And because they know that person is there for them, and very clear that person is not there to do their job for them, it's to help them do their job. I don't think they feel guilty going and asking, which makes a big difference.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of time. I don't think we also have any questions, at least not in the chat. But I just wanted to say thank you once again, because it was a brilliant presentation and I think you gave us lots of tips and food for thought. So thank you again, Ellie, for doing this. Yeah, lots of positive comments in the chat. The recording will be up soon. We'll let you know. And otherwise, have a lovely rest of the week. Thank you.